And welcome back to the Financial Deviant Podcast. Hope you guys are having a great day whenever you're listening to this. I think we're going to have some fun today. I want to talk a little bit about accumulation versus decumulation. I'm 53 years old, and even though I am not, quote, retiring today, it is something that I think about quite often, and it's pretty much the primary focus of my saving and investing efforts these days. It's preparing myself for my latter years. So I think one of the things that I want to do is to just kind of talk about some of the things that I'm personally thinking about, and inevitably there will be some people who will be able to identify with what I'm dealing with, because there are some things that are just common to all who are either preparing for retirement or in retirement. There are common things that those folks are thinking about, common things that are on those folks' minds. Talking about accumulation and decumulation. Accumulation being saving, investing, accumulating, acquiring, building assets, building wealth. And of course, the opposite is decumulation, is when you get to the point where you are no longer putting money aside, you're no longer contributing to your 401k or your IRA, but in the decumulation stage, you are spending. You've spent all these years accumulating. Now it's time to figure out how to spend that money. Although that may sound a little silly. What do you mean figure out how to spend all that money? That's crazy. You just spend it. You sell assets and you spend it. Well, there's been a lot of research out there over the years about this decumulation stage, and it's pretty clear that in many ways, accumulating is easier than decumulating, if that makes sense. Like I said, in the accumulation stage, the discussions are about your 401ks, your 403bs, your Roth or traditional IRAs, your annuities, your whatever vehicle you're using to save. But there's an entire industry that assists people in determining how to spend once they're no longer accumulating. And I've been kind of looking at that a lot more lately. First of all, talking about retirement. Retirement is a pretty recent thing in the whole scope of time, in the whole scope of history. The concept of retirement really didn't exist until the late 19th century. That was in 1889 when the Chancellor of Germany, a gentleman by the name of Otto von Bismarck, designed the world's first government-sponsored retirement program. And originally, you became eligible for that retirement program at age 70. After he developed that program, it started a domino effect around the world, including the United States, where governments started developing pension plans, retirement plans for civil servants. Because up until he developed that plan in Germany, people just worked until they died, for the most part. But if you look at how the lifespan was changing around that time he developed that program, he felt that if a person spent 30 years working for the government, then they deserved to be taken care of by the government once they'd reached a certain age. And again, that age was 70 originally. But until he developed that program, as I said, people just worked until they died. So that program came along as people started to live longer. So the need for such a program kind of raised its head, and he developed that first plan. But when you start thinking about retirement income for most of us is made up of Social Security, a pension if you have access to a pension, and whatever you have in your personal portfolio. Those are the three basic components. At one point, I actually started really being serious about saving when there was a lot of talk, and there still is a lot of talk about Social Security and whether it's going to be around when I got to retirement age, or whether it would be significantly reduced when I became of retirement age. So years ago, I remember that was kind of in my ear, and I started saying, you know what? I'm going to start saving as if Social Security is not going to be around when I get ready. And that was kind of my motivation, so that I would be responsible for taking care of myself, was the whole idea. Well, I no longer think that Social Security will be gone by the time I retire. I know there's still a lot of talk about that, but that would be what would equate to political suicide if Social Security would disappear. I know there's a lot of talk about when that fund will be depleted, and there's all kind of discussion about that, but there are definitely ways to stop that from happening. And like is often the case, I personally believe that we'll wait to the last minute before something is put in place to remedy that issue. But again, I no longer think it's going to disappear or dissipate by the time I get to retirement age. But again, so the three primary components of a person's retirement income, and let me say this before I move on with this. I talk about retirement being a relatively recent development or creation. Men typically, before it was created, just worked until the day they died. I started thinking I may try to change that and not maybe use the word retirement, because sometimes people think when you use the word retirement, you mean you're just going to stop doing anything. And just know that is not what I'm referring to. I think it's extremely important that when a person, quote, retires, that they have something to retire to. I really think it can be the beginning of the end when a person just retires and don't have anything to do and just decide to sit around and eat bonbons and whatever the case may be. I think it's extremely important. And there's a lot of research out there that supports that people need to have something to retire to, or retirement can literally be miserable. So again, those three primary components: Social Security, pension, if you have access, and whatever retirement assets you have put away in your personal funds. And I say personal, it could be your 401k from work. So one of the things that you will hear if you have any or read any literature or blogs or any books on the decumulation stage, where a person is now in retirement and now the goal is to live off of those three components of retirement income that I mentioned. If you are anywhere near anybody discussing that, you will hear something called the 4% rule. The 4% rule comes from a piece of published research that was done by a gentleman named Bill Bingen, who was a financial advisor. And he published his work in 1994. And his goal was to come up with the safe withdrawal rate that retirees could take from their personal assets and still have their money last for 30 years of retirement. Okay, does that make sense? So he was trying to see what was the perfect percentage of your personal assets that you could take out every year and still not run out of money during 30 years of retirement. So that's where the 4% rule came from. He said pretty much through any market, up or down, if you take 4% of your assets out the first year of retirement, and then after that, you would add on whatever the inflation rate is. So you take 4% the first year, then the second year you would take 4% plus whatever the inflation rate was. That's how he came up with the 4% rule. So if you think about that, let's say you had saved $30,000 to be spent during your retirement years. If you held to the 4% rule, that first year, you would take out $1,200 or $100 a month. Okay, as an example. So let's move it up a little bit. If you had put away $100,000, whether it's in your 401k or any other account, a brokerage account, or whatever the case may be, if you had $100,000, that means that first year you would sell assets worth $4,000 or $333 a month. If you had $250,000 saved, that will be 4% of that will be $10,000 or $833.33. So if it was $350,000, you would take out $14,000 that first year and then adjust for inflation every year thereafter. So that would be what, $1,166.66 a month. And last example, I'll say if you had put away $600,000, that means that first year you could take out $24,000 or $2,000 a month. So let's look at that. If your retirement income consists of Social Security, pension if you have access to it, and whatever assets you have already saved for retirement, that's one of the reasons that we want to really, really be aggressive in putting aside money for ourselves for our retirement years. Because whatever Social Security is, that's like, you just call that money in the bank. That's automatic. Okay. So, and then if you have pension, and I know a lot of educators who have pensions, that's awesome. So Social Security plus pension, and then the other component is your personal assets. But here's the thing. The one thing that people don't talk about enough, in my opinion, is spending. When people ask the question, how much money do I need to save before I'm able to retire? Well, you can't just talk about the assets. You can't talk about what you have in investments. You have to talk about what your spending is going to be. And on an earlier episode of the Financial Deviant, I talked about the fact that anybody who was nearing or on the doorstep of retirement, they really, really need, if at all possible, to have a paid for house. Because if you think about it, that's just going to significantly reduce the amount of money you need to live in retirement. And, it all depends on what kind of retirement you want to have. You can live a very simple, inexpensive retirement. Whole goal being to not run out of assets. Okay, that's fine. If you want to be able to travel a little more than that, you can put enough money away that allows you to do that. That's perfect. But in order to have a complete plan as to when you can retire and how much you need, you absolutely have to have a pretty good idea of what your spending is going to be. And that'll tell you the story. That'll tell you how much you need, which again will tell you when you can retire. One interesting thing about that, talking about spending in retirement, is there is a lot of research out there that basically says retirees aren't spending enough money. You heard me. Retirees are not spending enough money. They are spending only enough that it can be covered by Social Security and pension if they have it, in a lot of cases. A lot of retirees are not spending, are basically holding on to all of their investments and not spending it because there's a significant amount of fear of running out of money. Again, because you're no longer contributing, you're no longer saving, you're no longer investing. Now you're decumulating, now you're spending, now you're living off of that money that you spent years building off of. But there's a huge phobia within the retirement community that basically does not allow people to spend the amount of money they should spend. In other words, they live so much below their means that what ends up happening is they end up leaving a bunch of money for heirs. That I will tell you, that is happening. And there's a ton of research out there. And there's another piece of this, and that is the spending habits of retirees the longer they are retired. They spend less and less money as they age. And I don't think we should be shocked about that. So number one, they're not spending enough. They're living beneath their means because they're afraid they're going to run out of money. So they just keep their expenses so low that Social Security can cover it. And if they have a pension, they keep it so low that Social Security and pension can cover their expenses. And the result has been retirees whose portfolios, basically who become wealthier and wealthier as the years go on. Now that's kind of mind-blowing to me. But I've seen a lot of models and read a lot about this, and there's a lot of research that's gone on, and the spending habits of retirees is such that very often they become wealthier because they're spending so little. And that makes me a little uncomfortable. I actually had this discussion with my wife. I was like, we could wind up being some of these folks that really just, we want to leave our children something, don't get me wrong, but we're not trying to make them rich. So we were talking about, you know what, we might need to spend a little more money. We actually had that discussion. It's an uncomfortable discussion for me. It's a little easier, I think, for my wife. I think she's a little more comfortable spending. So, but for me, that's a little bit more of a challenge. But we actually had that discussion because I could actually see us possibly being in that situation. And again, we want to leave our children something, but we're not trying to make them independently wealthy. We don't want them to be lazy. How's that? So again, talking about the spending habits of retirees, there was a big consumer expenditure survey that was done, and they found that households aged 65 to 74 spent $44,897 a year. $44,897 a year. As they got to a group that was 75 or older, that $44,000 went down to $33,740. And the older people than that spent 25% less. And there are a number of surveys, and there's a lot of research out there that supports that same idea that as people get older, they're not spending as much money. And as a result, their assets that they have put away in their retirement accounts, whether it's IRAs, Roth IRAs, they tend to grow. And they wind up leaving too much money to their heirs. Now, if people want to do that, that's fine. But that's something that I just wanted to throw out there today because it is a very real thing. And there are a lot of retirees that could be enjoying more of their money, but they're afraid. They're afraid. And one of the things that can ease their minds a little bit, I talked about the 4% rule. That's just, again, it's called a rule, but it's just a guideline. What some people do is they don't take 4% that first year. They may take 2.5%, depends on what their expenses are. And they may be fine. So that's one thing that you can always vary that based on what's going on in the market. And that's one of the reasons that people keep their expenses to a point where a pension or their pension or their Social Security can cover their expenses, because when the market is down, they don't have to sell any assets, because they don't want to sell assets when they're down. And that's one of the reasons they do that. And then what happens sometimes is when the market is up while they're in retirement, they may splurge. They may even go buy a car or something, or whatever the case may be. That's just an interesting phenomena that has come up over and over and over again in my reading. And I just think it's something that we all should be cognizant of, because quite frankly, we can enjoy more money, more of our money that we've worked so hard to save. And I'll tell you something else. Another reason it's so important to have some retirement funds other than Social Security is you have that flexibility, like I just mentioned. You have that ability to raise your withdrawal rate if you need to, or lower it if you need to. And as I said a minute ago, I have a lot of people who are in education and they have pensions. And I will tell you, that is an amazing thing to have guaranteed income on top of Social Security. That is one of the major primary benefits of working for the state or for federal government. Having that pension, that automatic income, that risk-free income that allows you to, in many cases, take care of all of your needs and many of your wants without even having to sell any assets. Now, you want to talk about being able to live a happy latter part of your life. If you're in that situation where you have assets saved and you also have your expenses low and you have Social Security and or pension coming in every month that covers your expenses, that's a great place to be in. That is a great place to be in. And I never understood. I remember when my dad retired from teaching, and I remember him saying, I'm making more money now that I retired than I was when I was working. But what he was referring to, and I didn't realize obviously when I was younger, that he was getting the pension, but he was also getting Social Security on top of the pension. And of course, my mom getting a spousal benefit. So that's what he was referring to. And I didn't understand that at the time, but I do now. This whole idea of decumulation is something that can really take up a lot of time, because it's such a challenge for people to spend money. And I've told you on an earlier podcast, even now, sometimes I have a difficult time. Obviously, I'm not in retirement, but there are times I have difficulty spending money, especially if I'm trying to spend it on myself. I think it's easier for me to spend it on other people than it is for me to spend it on myself. I'm pretty simple. I have low needs. I'm low maintenance for the most part, although my wife might not always agree with that, but for the most part, I'm low maintenance as far as that kind of stuff goes. So another thing that I wanted to mention is, with all this stuff about how the spending of retirees reduces over time and how people's wealth is literally growing while they're in retirement because their spending is so low, what that basically means is it is highly possible, maybe even likely, that people don't need as much as they originally thought they needed to retire. I mean, if all these good folks are retiring and their wealth and assets are growing while they're no longer putting money in, that probably means that your retirement number may be lower, or maybe it needs to be lower than it is right now, and you may be fine. Only you can determine that, but that's the thought that came to mind. Is like, wow, how much money do you really need to live a comfortable retirement? And that answer is going to be different for everybody. It's going to be very different based on the individual, based on what the person does, based on what the person wants to do in retirement. But it's very possible that the number, or it's possible that you're saving too much. I never thought I would have that to come out of my lips, but it is possible that you're saving too much. Now, that doesn't mean I want you to just shut down everything and go buy a new car tomorrow unnecessarily, but it probably means that you just should be aware that once you get to those retirement years, really work on not being afraid to spend some of that money that you worked so hard to put away, and that you've been so disciplined to put away. And I will tell you, it's probably easier said than done, because the numbers are pretty staggering. When I say the numbers of retirees whose wealth is growing, even in retirement. On the other side of that, I mean, hey, it's not horrible. It's not terrible to leave an inheritance. We want to do that. But as I said earlier, we got to find that balance between, yes, leaving a little something, but also enjoying it, because we've worked hard and worked hard to be disciplined to be able to put ourselves in that situation. So you see, I always heard people say that, there are challenges that come with having money that people with no money don't have. And I'm not rich by any stretch, but I actually, when I started looking at this and doing a little research on this, that's the first thing that came to my mind. I was like, wow, now you have problems spending it. People, you usually think of people having problems accumulating it, saving it, or being disciplined enough to do so. But if you are able to do that, you may have a bigger challenge deciding how you want to spend it, because another component of decumulation is taxes. Although often your taxes will be less than they were when you were working, especially because capital gains tax are taxed at a lower rate than regular ordinary income. But that is also a consideration. How will you be taxed? In retirement, do you have a lot of tax deferred money, like in 401ks or traditional IRAs, that when you do take money out of those accounts, they will be taxed at that time, and the tax rate will be determined by your total income that you've earned in a given year. So there are all kinds of. That's one of the reasons that people sometimes, even if they don't have a financial advisor, a lot of times they find somebody to talk to once they get close to retirement, because there's just a lot of facets to doing that, and doing it well, and not putting yourself under too much tax burden at the same time. So I hope you've enjoyed this whole conversation about accumulation and decumulation. As you notice, I spent more time talking about decumulation because that is actually the challenge that I wanted to highlight on this particular episode. But I hope you've enjoyed it. Just give you something to think about. Maybe give you something to read up on further and do a little digging on your own. Obviously, I can't get into all the details. There's a lot of stuff surrounding that whole idea of decumulation, and how people can take distributions, and whether they use the 4% rule, or they take it down to a 3% rule or a 2.5% rule, or don't take anything their first year in retirement because they have their expenses covered by Social Security and a pension if they have access to one. So there are all kinds of things to consider, which is one of the reasons that people get a little nervous once they get close to retirement, and often they have to talk to someone. And that is a wise thing to do, because you want to put yourself in the best position possible to preserve your wealth and make sure you have money to take you through for the rest of your life. That's the goal. Again, this is the Financial Deviant. This is Mike. Hope you've enjoyed today's show, and we'll talk to you soon.